I'll introduce you real quick. Ah, are there any titles or affiliations you want me to include in your introduction? Otherwise, I'll just give you basically your name.
Name and I guess as well. Actually, I could start now. I could try the introduction and give it a go. How's that?
I'll just sit down then, and I'm there if I can help with anything.
Thank you so much. Sweet. It's really good to have you guys here. I'm sorry I'm interrupting. Now, let's begin. If we could just... Oh yeah, sweet, cool, that's awesome, sweet. So, hi, my name is Camille Cowley, and I've designed this talk with my partner, Daniel Burtonshaw, and I'd really like to thank the team at GDC. They've been absolutely wonderful for hosting this event and for giving me the opportunity to give this talk. And I'd also like to thank team members at Code Dunedin, especially V and Tim, particularly for all their support. And it's really nice to be able to talk about accessibility because it's often overlooked when we design applications, and so I'm really grateful just to be able to present it here to you. And there is a small caveat that these subjects can intersect with some very heavy wellbeing effects. And so from here there'd be cats, just to give a mental hug. It's something my partner Daniel started because sometimes we do need that as a small breather in amongst everything. Aha. So, the talk today, and so when I like to reflect on accessibility in New Zealand, I kind of refer back to some things that I was a big Douglas Adams fan, and I love The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it really sort of conveyed that feeling of lack of accessibility because the protagonist Arthur had lost his home, particularly because the information wasn't accessible, the spaces weren't accessible, and the system had been designed so that the outcome was predetermined without his input. And an example here is also that over 95% of websites in New Zealand are designed with critical accessibility issues. So this is not something that's a small issue, this is something that is present in almost every sector of New Zealand society. And it's also kind of ironic to do this talk in Wellington, which is incredibly inaccessible as a city. My partner Daniel, he wasn't able to come today because with his power chair and muscular dystrophy there would be nowhere for us to stay, and we had been homeless for quite a few years even as software engineers because there's less than 2% of housing in New Zealand that would allow us to even enter and even to use a bathroom. So that picture of homelessness is actually quite common for young people with disability in New Zealand. And I guess when it comes to well-being, there's a whole heap of core factors that we need to think of. And a really simple model for this is Maslow's hierarchy, where we try and solve the base aspects of well-being first, so things like access to food, medical needs, safe shelter. Then we go on to things like access to our communities, a feeling of belonging with the groups we have, and value connections. And then we go on to things like activities that invigorate the mind, ability to have work, ability to study, and in our case, a pet cat that loves snuggles. And I guess the urgency and scale for accessibility in New Zealand is quite often invisible. You don't see the people who are excluded because they've often been denied access to be seen. And tech has the ability to be the most accessible, but without access being included, we can be denied that belonging and denied and isolated. But I guess the effects of what I'm going to talk about isn't going to be detailed heavily here because it is a pretty harsh subject, and as a country we don't really deal well with well-being, and we haven't handled mental health particularly well in some cases, and so we do have significant disparities amongst certain communities and groups just on their ability to have well-being within the country. And so there's often also a sense of stigma or distrust when we try and access health services, and that is sort of kind of a bit sad, because we should be able to feel like we could reach out for help without being punished for it. And we should be able to, if we have work, we should be able to tell our employers that we are struggling, even though sometimes it might mean there might be some changes in what we can do about it. And I want to let everyone know here that there is help out there, but it is one of those things where you shouldn't feel like you should stop reaching out. You should always keep on going. And before I kind of talk about my path to tech, I actually should come up with an important, just quick subject here. It's often something that in media and in articles, there's a concept outlined by the advocate and teacher Stella Young, and she identified that often there was this theme of sort of inspiration porn, which was using disabled people in stories, and often a false narrative, and they would be used for like motivational posters or articles. And so in this case, Stella Young here says it's actually quite othering, and it's often objectifies disabled people in quite harmful ways. And while sounding positive, so one here is Scott Hamilton, and the only disability is a poor attitude. Well, not really. That's not what the reality is. And it often denies the potential of disabled people as well in patronizing ways, because in many senses, it says both we should only be accepting of that you can only achieve what is a state of normalcy, and even then there is no ability to be exceptional within that. And on top of that, it's very hard because it's a form of survivorship bias. And survivorship bias is very painful for those families and their friends who aren't as lucky and who have lost family members. And we attribute more skills and morals to those who have survived by luck, whereas I can directly compare to family members who are not alive anymore, and you'll never ever get to hear or their voices and how creative they have been in industries, because it's something that's so hard. It's not something that we all can succeed. It's something that we should be able to have the opportunity to do, but when we see inspiration porn, it often conveys this false narrative. And it's not being positive that turns stairs into a ramp, and it's not being positive that turns books into Braille. So there is another thing, that when we study disability, we often look at disability as it's someone with this medical condition. And it's very important to also note in that same example, it's not that you have a condition that requires you to use a wheelchair, that your disability is that people have put in place stairs. And it's not that your disability is being blind, it's that the ability for you to access online tools or websites is restricted. And that in itself is a huge thing, because a lot of people don't understand you can't use a CAPTCHA, for instance, necessarily. And that's something that is present in all website shopping. So it's tricky. So I guess the one thing we often also see around this is that there are employment gaps, and a path to get through to employment is often very different for different people, and we should all have empathy for it. And when I started, my dyslexia and autism in primary school just was completely unsupported, and my first words were actually the emergency alarm sounds of a medical machine. So I had started out learning things very differently. I was streamed into the lowest grade classes with little teaching and almost no school writing supports, and I had the ability to do higher level classwork, even winning competitions. But getting out of a low stream class for kids with learning differences is a huge fight, and it seems insurmountable. And for me, games became a huge lifesaver, because in many respects they gave me things that I could have as part of my wellbeing plan. They gave me goals and tasks and a sense of achievement that I couldn't get through school. And it actually came to a head because my mother was called to an attend an emergency disciplinary meeting with the deputy principal, my teacher and the librarian. And what had happened at this meeting, she was worried, had my daughter damaged something or burnt something down? And it was actually that she was called because they wanted to ban my access to the school library because they thought I couldn't read. And so they thought it would be a waste of their time to let me borrow the books. And in many respects, I would protest this. I said, look, I can read these books. And they didn't believe me. And my mum at this meeting said, but she's been reading the books, and they didn't believe her. And so they actually told her that we had to prove it on the spot that I could read the books. And the librarian took out the list of every single book that I had borrowed, and I had to give an on-the-spot detailed summary of each one. And afterwards, it was just so satisfying seeing the shocked look on the librarian's face, because she actually said they were better summaries than what the publishers themselves were giving. So there were other things I faced. So upon finding that science was extremely limited, particularly in my classes, there were sort of subjects that were seen suitable for women. So science was jewellery making or chocolate forming or, you know, these weird things that, you know, were related to cooking, but not really related to science. And so I actually fought to change schools. And then on top of that, I also had to fight my parents to be able to take more STEM subjects in art. And my dad actually only thought of me as a single gender, and he thought that the only suitable role as a woman would be for being a primary school teacher. And so, again, huge fights. And then on top of that, I had to argue for a university position because they often prejudge you without sometimes even looking at your grades or ability. And so I had to attend several interviews without any support or knowledge of what there would be at those interviews, and had to fight for my case. And this was done with the full knowledge that what I found out, they hadn't even looked at my grades at that point. And that was something that was quite weird, that they didn't know I'd achieved an A bursary or anything like that. It was just ignored. I guess it was much easier at university. I studied a conjoint of engineering with a double major of science. And I would say it was easier, and it was easier up until the point I had a teacher sexually assault me and then stalk me in my workplace. And at that point, you'd think that might be one isolated case, but then my life and experience in tech and software engineering roles hadn't necessarily got better. One games company I worked for actually denied access for me to attend my meetings to deliver my progress reports. And I was paid half the rate of the junior developers that I would not only have to train, but also have to manage, and on top of that do the same engineering work and my own engineering work on top. And at that point, I actually had colleagues who wanted me to stay in that company no matter what. So they were actually offering to donate their wages just to be able to keep me in that role. But I said they shouldn't lose out on behalf of these company managers. And so it's something that often we can find really good companies, but sometimes we will face bad ones. And at that stage, we should be able to say, hey, there's something wrong here. It was similar for Daniel, who was the tech lead in our project at the moment, and he was very lucky. He fought to educate himself in environments that were dismissive, hostile, and inaccessible, particularly because he had muscular dystrophy and ADHD. And he actually, after years of enterprise IT, wound up teaching at Auckland University. And back then they didn't have accessible transport to universities, and often still don't. So I had to participate in, let's say, lots of creative vehicle parking options, because it's sort of one of those things where you need to be able to make access sometimes. And it is quite sad that often that isn't available, and it's getting worse sometimes with a lot of parking being taken away for us, so that we often don't have access to universities now. If we tried what we did back then, it would be banned and illegal outright, and so we would not have access to study if we tried to go back now. And still, we're the lucky ones in New Zealand, because near half of youth with disabilities are denied those opportunities, education, employment, and training. And more than half of disabled adults under the age of 65 are are actually unable to access work. And many of them have a very high capability for work, but often are being denied those opportunities. And you could pretty much flip a coin, and with that you would not have access to stable employment in your lifetime. And unfortunately that's a very real experience amongst most people with disabilities. And I guess it's quite sad that, you know, over half the children living in poverty are from families with disabilities. And that's just simply because often you don't have enough income, or sometimes have no income support if you have a disability and are unable to work. But I guess it shouldn't really be that way, because as we go, you know, accessibility needs are not static throughout anyone's lifetime. You know, you may not start out with a disability, but during all our lifetimes, we will at some point actually become or have and adapt or even short-term disabilities. Sometimes, you know, it could be something like a sensory disability as we get older, or it could be something that's mobility as we have an illness or an accident. It could be something that's a cognitive processing abilities. It could be any number of things that we acquire that could be just really short-term, or they could be degenerative or impact us for a very long period. And as gamers, you might understand that, like any sports, we do often get injuries like repetitive strain in our wrists, or, you know, our eyesight might slightly start getting worse slightly earlier on, and those sorts of things will impact us. And eventually, every single human will have an experience of disability. It just may not have hit you yet. And another thing I'd like to say is that often being disabled is not a choice, and we often don't choose to be disabled, and you don't get to choose necessarily how you can get to work, and you often don't get to choose, say, certain elements of society or life. We sometimes only have one option, and if that's not there, we then can't go there. So accessibility is often sometimes providing that only option. And there are 4 key principles when we look at designing something for accessibility. And it's an acronym, PAW, easy to remember, PAW. But it's quite common that when it comes to accessibility, sometimes the most frequently missed one is something perceivable by someone. And so that could just be easy things like adding captions. It could be something like making sure the display of the text and the HUD information is very visible. And it can even be, say, allowing for different types of user inputs or keyboard binding. And unfortunately, sometimes you have things like lots of VR games just often aren't accessible because they often assume that you're able to stand or use your arms, which for my partner, he's been excluded from a lot of VR games just simply because of those factors. And then we kind of have operable as being one where we are looking directly at all these control factors, but also the assumption that, you know, what we can experience and what we can do ourselves might not be easy for someone else to do. And they might be using different third-party tools or different controllers, and having the option to just allow for binding of these things is huge, because it means immediately you can start using anything. And then we kind of take for a given that any information displayed is clearly understandable, but often when that doesn't happen, it's generally considered a bug. So if a player has a game feature and it's not understandable, or it doesn't operate the way you expect it to, often that is definitely a bug. Like, you know, you start the quest can't complete, or it doesn't act the way it's meant to, we'd say that's a bug. You know, if the quest is broken in any way that it can't complete, we would definitely, bug. But finally, you know, if you are playing on different consoles, mobiles or computers, we want it to act and be robust. We want it to function in the same way and deliver a similar experience for everyone, regardless of whether they're PC or console, or what type of screen sizes they have, what type of resolutions they have. We want it to still be able to be conveyed on all these things. So I guess as well, one thing is that unsurprisingly, accessibility features are predominantly used by non-disabled players. And is there anyone surprised by that? Sweet. So games with these features are often infamous if they are excluding something like captions, or if you can't save the game. Small things that enable someone with a disability to play, if you can't do it as a non-disabled player, it's still annoying. And there are lots of real-life living situations that would mean we'd use accessibility features even though we don't have disabilities. And here's one here. You can only play one-handed. And for my partner in this case, it's like, sorry, can't chat, cat. And so, you know, going through some of those really common features, it's sort of these things like we have these different controls. We don't sort of lock people into specific vendor options. We often allow for key binding, saving. You know, we have different audio settings broken down by their use. But things like also having visual cues for sounds that are played in game that are important, or having sounds for something that's visually displayed but often might not be perceptible. You know, high contrast modes, just something that you can actually be able to receive the information. And it's not necessarily that you might have a specific blindness. It might be that you're colorblind, or it might be that you have ocular migraines or vision difficulties, but you're not technically blind. And so being able to play a game is still pretty important, just to have those features so you can reduce, I guess, sometimes some of the impacts of other features that might distract you or might prevent you from being able to play. There are some things as well, like for mobility, having quick time options and key hold or press options. So if you can't repeatedly press something, being able to just press once or press and hold can be a huge difference. And it would mean that stops a game from being completely unplayable to actually being playable, and someone would be able to go to completion. And so if we're planning on any certain devices or features of gameplay, it's actually straightforward and easier if we design for accessibility outright than trying to shoehorn things in later. So if you are designing for having captions from the get-go, it's easier to set them up so that they can be customizable. It's easier to have them ready to display in the format that's easy for the user to read than trying to sort of shoehorn captions and, oh no, we haven't just set up any of the features to enable it to be optional, or we haven't been able to say, here's the options that you can have for saving the game. You know, if you don't have that ahead of time in your design, it can be very, very tricky. So in this case, we want to be able to have options with captions, and why that might be is that we actually have different, you know, captions that people can read, and often sometimes captions we can't read, and often captions that don't have backgrounds as well can be completely imperceptible to the eye. And you imagine just if you had a light colored font on a light colored picture, it completely unreadable. But even with something like buttons that have those low contrast between the text and what's behind it, it's almost as if that button doesn't exist at all. And it's the same thing when we go through captions. We want to be able to see who's speaking, we want to have them concise so they can be read quickly, and we want to make sure that they're very clear and easy to see. So things that also include how we use color and how we also represent colors to other people. And so She Remembered Caterpillars actually not only just incorporated contrast into their design, so it's clear and easy to see what were the active parts of the game, but it also meant that they included shapes and icons to represent those colors, because this is a color matching and color mixing game, but it can be completely played by those who have no visual ability for color. So it could be black and white, and it would still be completely playable from the get-go. We have The Last of Us, which is actually really interesting because this game can be completely played by someone who is blind. And it's because they have included a lot of audio cues and visual clues. And so in this regard, we actually see that there's a lot here that would allow someone to play even just with the aim assist modes. And again, with control options, we've got the quad stick we've got options that could allow for single-handed play, and we've got the Xbox controller. And Assessed has select difficulty modes. And this allows players who have difficulty sometimes with mobility or cognitive processing to be able to play the game. And we actually have quite a few heroes in the accessibility sector who would allow us this feature. They offer guides for designers to be able to step through. So Microsoft and Able Gamers actually allow you to sort of learn and see what sort of features you want to play with. How would I go about designing for controls? How would I go about designing for different visual features? And so lastly, I guess would be going through some of these things which I really want to make key is often disabled players and players with mental health difficulties or challenges and players who are susceptible to predatory monetization are actually used and picked on by designers in some ways, in ways we don't want to have, and we can design games that are actually hostile to these players. And a lot of this is through predatory monetization tactics. So tactics that would be seen as behavioral challenges or things that sort of milk the attitude for players to have OCD, or things that would enable us to have that gambler's fallacy that a win is just right around the corner, even though it really isn't. So it's actually quite a big issue that's been coming up because a lot of these games are designed so that players cannot play them without spending large amounts of money. And an example as well as Diablo Immortal, where for even getting one of the gems that are required to have as your character completion, it took him over $25,000 just to acquire it. He wouldn't be able to acquire it normally, not within the game's lifetime, and not within his lifetime. And so lastly, I guess I'd like to actually have a note here as well that is, we should probably save the whales, because what research has actually found is that they are predominantly those with neurodiversities, disabilities, and increasingly we also find that we've hooked in children, we've hooked in people with mental health and addictions, and we've hooked them in, and it's something that often they feel like they cannot escape from if they want to play the game. And once it's hooked them, it's very hard to break away. It's very hard to be able to protect yourself in these environments and to stop yourself from being used in this regard. And so we just want to be able to make sure that we can have things open, accessible, and to make sure that they're safe for players as well in the design. And I guess that's a really big feature to come across with, is that we want to make sure that not only can we have games that enable players to play, that enable the well-being of players in those environments, but also games that enable the future of designers to actually look at them and be able to say, I feel good that I've designed this, and I have an ethical response to the way I go about these things. And it's so important to our well-being, even from behind the scenes, to be able to feel like we can come up to employees and say, hey, you know, I don't feel good about this, or hey, there's something wrong. And if we don't have accessibility there from the get-go, often you can't even do that. Do I have time? 1 minute. So another key feature in this case is also when you think about privacy and security. And I'll leave you with another anecdote or another description. So there was a company that would be storing users' passwords in plain text, and this actually left it open so that there would be identity fraud. And the engineer who discovered this actually came up to the manager and the boss and said, look, you know, we've got these passwords plain text. You actually have to go about actually setting that up, because normally they're encrypted by default. And that they would let people log in to other people's emails accounts. They'd let people log in to other systems that they operated and then use their bank details. And from there, the solutions were provided to the managers, but what happened instead was the engineer was actually disciplined, and then from there they had constructive dismissal. even though that they just brought it to the manager's attention, not having an environment where our canaries in the coal mine can speak up about these things that are security faults, privacy faults, or flaws, in that case, it creates a negative environment for everyone. So we want to really encourage the people who speak up. We want to encourage those canaries, and we want to make sure that you can speak up about discrimination, you can speak up about harassment, or you can speak up about something that's critical security features that are important for not only the players, but also the company and the job. Thank you.
I'm afraid we do not have time for questions.
I'm so sorry.
But we will